In the Middle Ages, society was shaped by a structure known as feudalism, and at the heart of that system stood the lords. These were the men who held land, commanded loyalty, and maintained authority over those who lived within their domains. They were not kings, though many served kings. They were not peasants, though they relied entirely on peasants for their wealth. Lords occupied the middle ground, powerful enough to control large territories and the people within them, yet still part of a wider network of obligations that bound them to higher rulers. The foundation of a lord's power was land. In the medieval world, wealth was not measured in coins alone, but in acres of fields, forests, and villages. Whoever controlled land controlled food, resources, and people. A lord might hold a single manor, with 1 or 2 villages attached, or he might oversee dozens of estates spread across wide regions. The more land he held, the greater his influence, for land produced crops, livestock, and rents that could be turned into wealth. With land came people. Farmers and peasants lived and worked on the estates of their lord, bound to him through obligation. Some were serfs, legally tied to the land, unable to leave without permission. Others were free peasants, who paid rent for their plots but still owed duties. To these men and women, the lord was both master and protector. He had authority over their labor, their payments, and often even their personal disputes. In return, he was expected to provide safety, shelter, and some measure of stability in a world often marked by war and uncertainty. Lords were not only landlords but also local rulers. In their estates, they acted as judges, military leaders, and guardians of order. They decided disputes, enforced laws, and ensured that their peasants fulfilled their obligations. They commanded knights, who swore loyalty to them in exchange for land or support, and they themselves swore loyalty to greater lords or kings. Power flowed in this chain of obligation, but at each level, it depended on control of land and people. To the villagers, the lord was often the most visible symbol of authority. His castle or manor house stood above the fields as a reminder of his strength. His knights rode through the countryside enforcing his rule. His officials collected rents, fines, and dues. Even the church often reinforced his authority, for the local priest or monastery relied on his patronage. The Lord's presence was everywhere, not only in times of conflict, but in the daily routines of farming, trade, and worship. Maintaining power was never simple. Lords faced rivals, rebellions, and the constant challenge of keeping their people loyal. Yet through a combination of landholding, military force, legal authority, and social influence, they managed to remain the backbone of medieval governance. Their power was not absolute, but it was enduring, shaping the lives of millions across centuries of European history. The root of every medieval lord's power was land. In the Middle Ages, land was more than soil to grow crops on. It was the source of wealth, status, and authority. Whoever held land could feed people, collect rents, and raise soldiers. Without land, there was no power, and with land came control not only over resources, but over the people who lived upon it. The medieval world was built on a structure known as the feudal system, a hierarchy that organized society into layers of obligation. At the top stood the king, who claimed ownership of all land within the kingdom. Beneath him were his great lords, nobles who received large estates in exchange for loyalty, taxes, and military service. These nobles, in turn, granted portions of their land to lesser lords or knights, who promised to serve them in battle. At the bottom of this structure were the peasants, who actually worked the land but had little to no power themselves. For lords, land was the key to maintaining influence. A single manor might contain fields, pastures, meadows, and a village. The peasants who lived there farmed the soil, raised animals, and paid dues. They provided the labor, but the benefits flowed upward, enriching the lord who owned the estate. The more manors a lord controlled, the greater his ability to gather wealth, provide soldiers, and exert authority. This arrangement was sustained through a system of vassalage. When a king granted land to a lord, it was not a gift but a contract. The lord swore loyalty or homage, promising to serve the king in times of need. In return, the land was his to govern, use, and pass to his heirs. Lords repeated this pattern with their own vassals. A knight might be granted a small estate, known as a fief, in exchange for riding to war whenever his lord called. These oaths created a chain of loyalty that linked peasants to knights, knights to lords, and lords to kings. The manor system was the practical foundation of this structure. Each manor operated almost like a self-contained world. Peasants farmed strips of land, tended livestock, and performed labor services on the lord's domain, the portion of land kept directly under his control. In return, they had the right to farm small plots for themselves, though they owed a portion of their harvest as rent. Mills, ovens, and presses on the manor were controlled by the lord, and peasants had to pay fees to use them. This ensured that wealth flowed constantly from the village to the manor house, strengthening the lord's position. The connection between land and loyalty gave lords both economic and military strength. The surplus from their estates allowed them to equip knights, maintain garrisons, and build castles. It also gave them leverage in politics. A lord with vast estates could raise more troops and influence, making him a valuable ally or a dangerous rival to kings. But land was more than an economic asset. It carried status and prestige. To be a lord was to be a landholder, someone whose authority stretched over fields, villages, and people. A title without land was an empty honor, but even a small estate gave a man power in his locality. Castles, manor houses, and heraldic banners were all outward signs of land ownership, symbols that reminded everyone of who held control. Through the feudal system, medieval lords maintained power by linking land to loyalty, obligation, and survival. Every bushel of grain harvested, every tax collected, and every knight sworn to service flowed back to the land. It was the soil itself, worked by peasants and defended by soldiers, that formed the true foundation of lordship. If land was the foundation of a medieval lord's power, then peasants and serfs were the people who made that land productive. The fields did not plow themselves, the crops did not grow on their own, and the livestock did not tend to themselves. It was the constant labor of peasants that kept the system functioning. Lords depended on them for food, rents, and labor services, and controlling them was one of the main ways lords maintained authority. Most peasants in the Middle Ages fell into two broad groups, serfs and free peasants. The difference was important, though both lived under the authority of the lord. Serfs were legally tied to the land. They could not leave without permission, and their children were bound by the same obligations. They were not slaves. They could not be bought and sold in open markets, but their freedom was very limited. They owed their lord labor, rent, and obedience, and in return they were allowed to farm small strips of land to feed their families. Free peasants had more rights. They could sometimes move between manors or negotiate rents. But freedom did not mean independence. They still owed payments, often in the form of grain, livestock, or money. They also had to use the lord's mill, oven, or wine press, paying fees each time. Even when they were not legally tied to the land, they were still bound by obligations that ensured the lord benefited from their work. The control lords exercised over peasants was not only economic, but also legal and personal. Within a manor, the lord had judicial authority. Disputes between peasants, questions of inheritance, and cases of theft or neglect were often judged in the manorial court, presided over by the lord or his steward. This meant that the same person who collected rents also judged whether peasants were fulfilling their duties. The power of law and property rested in the same hands, leaving little room for peasants to resist. Labor services were one of the clearest ways lords maintained power. A serf might owe several days a week working directly on the lord's fields, known as the domain. This could mean plowing, planting, harvesting, or repairing fences and roads. These tasks were often performed at the busiest times of the farming year, which meant peasants had less time to tend to their own plots. The system ensured that the lord's crops came first, while peasants' survival depended on whatever time and energy remained. In addition to labor, peasants paid rents and dues. These were often taken in kind: grain, eggs, chickens, wool, or firewood. Sometimes money was accepted, especially later in the Middle Ages as coinage became more common. But money or goods, the effect was the same. Wealth flowed from the peasantry upward, supporting the lifestyle of the lord and his household. Even small events in a peasant's life came with payments. Marriages, inheritances, and even the right to pass land on to children could require fees. This constant flow of dues reinforced the lord's authority. Another form of control came through restriction of movement. Serfs could not simply leave the manor to seek better opportunities elsewhere. If they fled, they risked being captured and returned, and in many cases their families would be punished. This tied them to the land generation after generation. Even when serfs gained some measure of freedom by moving to towns or buying their liberty, the process was long and costly. By keeping peasants bound, lords ensured a steady supply of labor for their estates. Daily life for peasants revolved around their obligations. They rose early, worked long hours in the fields, and still owed time and produce to the lord. Their cottages were simple, often one room shared with animals. Food was plain and repetitive. Yet the presence of the lord was constant, in the rents collected, the labor demanded, and the justice dispensed in manorial courts. For the peasant, the lord was not a distant figure, but an everyday authority shaping every aspect of survival. To maintain this control, lords relied not only on tradition and law, but also on force and intimidation. Castles and armed retainers served as reminders of power. Rebellions did occur. Groups of peasants sometimes rose against heavy burdens, but such uprisings were usually crushed quickly. The imbalance of resources made resistance difficult. Most peasants, knowing their options were limited, continued to live within the framework set by the lord. Still, this control was not purely one-sided. Lords depended on peasants, just as peasants depended on lords. The relationship, though unequal, was one of mutual necessity. Peasants needed protection from raids, bandits, or rival lords, and they needed access to land to feed their families. Lords needed food, rents, and labor to maintain their wealth and authority. This balance, though often harsh on the peasantry, was the glue that held feudal society together. In this way, lords maintained power not only by owning land, but by binding peasants and serfs to it. Through obligations, rents, courts, and restrictions, they ensured that the labor of the many supported the privileges of the few. It was a system that endured for centuries, shaping the rhythm of medieval life and keeping lords at the center of authority. One of the most visible and practical ways medieval lords maintained power was through military strength. Land and wealth gave them authority, but without force to protect it, that authority could be easily challenged. In an age of frequent wars, raids, and disputes, a lord's ability to defend his estate and enforce his will depended on soldiers, knights, and strongholds. Power was never secure unless it could be backed by arms. At the heart of this strength stood the castle. Castles were not merely homes, they were fortresses. Built of wood in earlier centuries and later of stone, they rose above the countryside as symbols of authority. Their thick walls, towers, and gates provided defense against attacks. From the battlements, guards could watch for danger across miles of fields. Villagers working in the lord's land saw the castle daily, a reminder that they lived under protection, but also under control. The castle was both practical and symbolic. In practical terms, it gave the lord a stronghold from which he could resist rivals, shelter his household, and protect his people in times of conflict. In symbolic terms, it displayed wealth and power. To approach a massive stone fortress was to be reminded of the resources and authority that built it. Castles intimidated would-be rebels and warned neighboring lords not to interfere. They were the clearest expression of military power in stone. Within these castles and manors, lords maintained private armies. These were not large by modern standards, but they were enough to enforce control locally. At the core were knights, warriors trained from youth in the arts of riding, fighting, and wielding weapons. Knights were bound to their lords through oaths of loyalty and the granting of land, known as fiefs. In return for their estates, they promised to fight when called. A powerful lord might have dozens of knights ready to ride under his banner, while a greater noble might command hundreds. Supporting the knights were men-at-arms, foot soldiers who fought with spears, swords, or crossbows. Some were retainers, kept in the lord's service year-round, while others were levied from among the peasants when needed. These levies were less trained, but they added numbers to the lord's forces. In times of war, Peasants often fought alongside professionals, providing the manpower required for campaigns. Military service was central to the feudal contract. Just as peasants owed labor on the land, vassals owed military service to their lords. This meant that power could be multiplied. A lord with many vassals could call upon their knights, who in turn had their own retainers. When summoned, they gathered under the lord's banner, forming an army built from layers of obligation. These forces were not permanent standing armies, but could be raised quickly when danger threatened. The presence of armed men also helped lords enforce authority at home. Disobedience, refusal to pay rents, or attempts at rebellion could be met with the threat of force. A few armed knights were often enough to remind peasants of the consequences of defiance. Justice was backed by swords, and the manorial court, where disputes were judged, always carried the shadow of military power behind its decisions. Lords also relied on their military strength to expand their influence. Raids on neighboring lands, small wars between rival nobles, and contests over borders were common in the Middle Ages. Success in such conflicts could bring new land, new vassals, and greater prestige. Failure, however, could mean loss of territory and weakened authority. Maintaining a capable military force was therefore not optional. It was the difference between growth and decline. The cost of maintaining soldiers was high, but it reinforced power. Knights required land, equipment, and support. Castles demanded upkeep, with garrisons to staff the walls and supplies to withstand sieges. Lords managed these costs through rents, dues, and taxes collected from peasants. In this way, the cycle continued. The labor of peasants funded the military, and the military ensured that peasants remained under the lord's control. Even in times of peace, the military presence was constant. Knights trained for war through tournaments and practice battles, sharpening their skills. Castles remained garrisoned, their towers manned by watchful guards. The very sight of armed retainers riding through the countryside reminded everyone that the lord's authority rested on more than words. It rested on steel and stone. Through military strength, lords secured their land, defended their people, and demonstrated their dominance. Castles stood as physical markers of control, while knights and soldiers embodied the force that upheld it. In the medieval world, power without arms was fragile, but power supported by armed force could endure for generations. Power in the Middle Ages was not only about castles and knights. It was also about law and justice. A lord's authority was reinforced, not just by the strength of his sword, but by his role as judge over the people who lived on his lands. In many ways, law was as powerful a tool as military force, because it shaped daily life, regulated disputes, and reminded peasants of their obligations. On most estates, justice was carried out in the manorial court. This was not a grand hall of royal judges, but a local gathering, often held in a barn, an open courtyard, or a chamber of the manor house. Here, peasants came to resolve disputes, confess wrongs, or hear judgments. The court was presided over by the lord himself, or more often by his steward or bailiff, acting in his name. Attendance was usually compulsory. Even those not directly involved in a case might be required to witness proceedings, reinforcing the collective authority of the lord over the community. The cases heard in these courts covered many aspects of rural life. Disputes over land boundaries were common. A quarrel over a strip of field or access to common pasture could easily arise, and the lord's court decided who was in the right. Breaches of custom were also punished. If a peasant refused to perform his labor services or failed to pay rent, he could be fined. Even small matters like baking bread in a private oven instead of the lord's could be brought before the court because it denied the lord his rightful fee. More serious crimes such as theft or violence could also fall under a lord's jurisdiction, though in some cases these were passed to higher courts under royal authority. Still, within the manor, the lord had sweeping powers. He could fine, confiscate property, or in some instances order physical punishments. His word carried the weight of law for the peasants who lived on his land. To defy the judgment of the court was to defy the lord himself, something few dared to do. The court was not always purely punitive. It also functioned as a place where community rules were reaffirmed. Customary law. the traditions of how fields were shared, when labor was owed, or how inheritance worked, was recited and reinforced in these sessions. By repeating these customs in a formal setting, lords ensured that peasants remembered their obligations. The law, in this sense, was a way of binding generations to the same duties. The presence of law also gave lords a powerful way to legitimize their control. It was one thing to demand rents or services by force, but quite another to present these demands as lawful. By holding courts, lords could say they were not merely exploiting peasants but upholding justice. Even fines and dues, when imposed through legal process, carried an air of fairness, though in reality the system heavily favored the lord. In some cases, lords extended their legal authority beyond their own manors. Wealthy nobles were often granted rights of high justice, meaning they could hold courts for major crimes, including robbery or even murder. This placed them almost on the level of kings within their territories. Such powers allowed them to dominate not only peasants but also lesser lords, making their estates small centers of independent authority. For peasants, the manorial court was inescapable. It was where they swore oaths, made payments, and sought permission for many aspects of life. A serf might need the court's approval to marry, to pass land to his children, or to move away from the manor. Each of these permissions often came with a fee. In this way, law and obligation were intertwined, making every stage of life subject to the lord's oversight. Even outside of court sessions, the presence of officials reinforced legal control. Bailiffs collected rents and enforced fines. Reeve officials, often peasants elected from among their neighbors, ensured that labor obligations were met. These men carried the authority of the lord into the fields and villages, reminding everyone that law was not a distant concept but a daily reality. By combining military strength with legal authority, lords made their power almost impossible to resist. Knights and soldiers ensured obedience through force, while courts and customs bound peasants through law. Together, these systems created an environment where the authority of the lord was reinforced at every turn. To live on a medieval manor was to live within a web of duties, judgments, and rules that all pointed back to the same figure, the lord. The use of justice and law shows how lords maintained power in subtle as well as obvious ways. Castles and armies could defeat rebellion, but law shaped everyday behavior, keeping order without constant violence. In this sense, law was not separate from power. It was one of its most effective forms. Beyond land, peasants, and knights, another pillar of a medieval lord's power was economic control. Wealth sustained everything: castles, soldiers, courts, and displays of prestige. Lords did not produce this wealth themselves. They drew it from the people who lived on their estates, from the systems of dues and rents that touched every corner of peasant life. By controlling the economy of their manors, lords secured the resources needed to maintain their position. The primary source of income was rent. Peasants who lived on the lord's land were required to pay for the right to farm their strips of field or live in their cottages. These rents could be paid in kind: sacks of grain, livestock, wool, or other goods, or increasingly in the later Middle Ages, in money. Whether paid in food or coin, rent represented a steady flow of wealth from peasant households into the lord's coffers. It ensured that every harvest, no matter how modest, yielded something for the manor. In addition to rent, lords profited from labor obligations. Serfs owed a certain number of days each week working directly on the lord's domain, the portion of land kept for his use. Whatever was grown there went entirely to the lord, not to the peasants. This provided him with grain, hay, and other produce that could support his household or be sold at market. Even when labor services were later commuted into money payments, the effect was the same. The peasants' work enriched the lord. Lords also controlled essential facilities, charging peasants to use them. On many manors, the only mill for grinding grain belonged to the lord. Peasants could not grind their wheat or barley at home. They had to bring it to the manorial mill and pay a fee, often a portion of the flour itself. The same applied to bake ovens and wine presses. By monopolizing these services, lords guaranteed another stream of income. Even the most basic task of turning grain into bread was tied to their authority. Markets and fairs provided further opportunities. Many lords had the right to establish markets within their lands, charging tolls on goods sold and on traders who passed through. Weekly markets allowed peasants to buy and sell food, cloth, and tools, but each transaction contributed to the lord's wealth through fees. Larger annual fairs, often lasting several days, attracted merchants from far away, bringing exotic goods and generating significant revenue. Lords who controlled busy trade routes or prosperous towns could profit greatly from these events. Tolls extended to roads, bridges, and rivers as well. A lord who controlled a crossing point could demand payment from travelers and merchants. These tolls might seem small in isolation, but over time they added up, turning geography itself into a source of income. By controlling movement through his territory, a lord not only gained wealth but also reinforced his authority. The castle and household were sustained by this economic system. Food from rents and labor filled the lord's storehouses. Wool, hides, and surplus grain could be sold for coin. Money rents paid for luxuries, fine cloth, wine, spices, that marked the lord's status. The manor was not only a center of political and military power, but also an economic hub, where wealth from the surrounding countryside flowed inward. The economic power of lords extended even into life events. Marriage dues were charged when peasants married, inheritance fees when land passed to heirs, and fines when obligations were neglected. Death itself brought income. When a serf died, the lord often claimed the best animal or possession as a heriot. At every stage of life, peasants contributed to the lord's wealth, making his economic control unavoidable. This system was not without strain. Bad harvests meant peasants struggled to pay, and sometimes lords reduced rents temporarily to prevent total collapse. But the general pattern held. Wealth flowed upward from the many to the few. The peasants labored, and the lords reaped the benefits. It was a cycle that could be harsh, but it was also stable enough to endure for centuries. Economic control gave lords flexibility and strength. With wealth, they could maintain castles, reward vassals, and hire soldiers. With money, they could buy luxuries that reinforced their status or lend to kings in return for favors. With food stores, they could endure sieges or feed retainers. Wealth was the foundation that allowed military, legal, and symbolic power to function. In this way, lords maintained power not only by force or law, but by ensuring that every economic activity within their lands, from farming and milling to trade and inheritance, contributed to their authority. The economy of the manor was not separate from their power. It was one of its deepest roots. In the medieval world, religion shaped nearly every aspect of life, and lords understood the power it carried. The church was not only a spiritual authority, but also a political and social force, influencing how people lived, worked, and thought. By aligning themselves with the church, lords strengthened their control, presenting themselves as both earthly rulers and protectors of the faith. Religion gave their authority an aura of divine approval, making their rule appear natural and unquestionable. At the most basic level, lords acted as patrons of local churches. Many villages had small parish churches built on land granted by the lord. He often provided resources for the construction of the building, gave land for its upkeep, and sometimes chose the priest who would serve there. This patronage gave him influence over the spiritual life of the community. When peasants attended Mass, prayed for good harvests, or confessed their sins, they did so in a church tied closely to the lord's estate. Lords also supported monasteries and religious houses. Donations of land or money secured prayers for the donor's soul, ensuring remembrance in this life and salvation in the next. These gifts also linked lords with powerful monastic institutions that held their own influence in politics and society. By supporting monasteries, lords displayed piety while also reinforcing alliances with respected religious communities. In return, monks and priests often spoke of the importance of loyalty to one's lord, weaving obedience into both earthly and heavenly duty. Religion also reinforced the social order. The church taught that society was divided into three groups: those who prayed, the clergy; those who fought, the nobility; and those who worked, the peasants. Lords fit into the second category, charged with defending both the land and the faith. This teaching justified the hierarchy, making it seem divinely ordained. For peasants, serving their lord was not only a social obligation but a religious one, for rebellion could be framed as sin. Through religious rituals, lords displayed their role as defenders of the faith. They attended services in the front of the church, donated to holy feasts, and led processions during festivals. Knights swore oaths on relics and the Gospels, blending loyalty to their lords with loyalty to God. Lords themselves might take part in crusades or wars framed as holy causes, reinforcing the idea that their authority was bound to the will of heaven. Religion also shaped daily obligations. Peasants owed the tithe, usually 1/10 of their harvest, to the church. While this was officially collected for religious use, lords often controlled or influenced how it was gathered, and sometimes even benefited indirectly. Beyond tithes, peasants also gave offerings, attended feast days, and observed church calendars that structured the rhythm of the agricultural year. Lords, by supporting and upholding these religious practices, tied their authority to the same rhythms. At times, lords used religion as a tool of legitimacy. A charter sealed with the approval of a bishop carried more weight. A coronation or a knighting ceremony performed with blessings framed authority as sacred. Castles and manors often had chapels, where prayers were said not only for the souls of the lords but also for their households and retainers. To rule with the church's blessing was to rule with God's blessing in the eyes of medieval people. Of course, the relationship between lords and the church was not always without tension. The church held its own vast lands and wealth, sometimes rivaling or even surpassing that of nobles. Bishops and abbots could act like lords themselves, holding courts, collecting rents, and commanding loyalty. Disputes arose when the interests of secular lords clashed with those of churchmen. But even in conflict, lords had to respect the spiritual authority of the church, for excommunication, being cut off from the sacraments, could undermine their legitimacy in the eyes of their people. For ordinary peasants, the blending of lordship and religion made authority nearly unshakable. To disobey the Lord was not only to risk punishment in this life, but potentially to risk salvation in the next. The fields, the church, and the manor all reinforced the same message. Loyalty, obedience, and duty were the natural order, sanctioned by God and upheld by the Lord. In this way, lords maintained power not only through military force or economic control, but also through the spiritual weight of religion. By presenting themselves as protectors of the faith, patrons of the church, and upholders of God's order, they turned obedience into more than a social necessity. They made it a religious one. For medieval people, this combination of earthly and divine authority made the Lord's rule seem as enduring and unchangeable as the church bells that marked the passing of every day. Power in the Middle Ages was not only enforced by soldiers or upheld by law. It was also displayed through symbols, visible reminders that reinforced the Lord's position in society. These symbols surrounded people in daily life, shaping how they thought about authority. For peasants and vassals, such signs were constant, quiet reminders that their lord stood above them, a figure of wealth, influence, and permanence. The most obvious symbol was the castle. Castles were practical fortresses, but they also served as monuments to lordly power. Their high towers dominated the countryside, visible for miles around. A stone castle announced to everyone who saw it that the land belonged to a powerful family. Even when not under attack, the sight of its walls, battlements, and gates carried an unspoken message. The Lord was strong, secure, and enduring. For villagers working in nearby fields, the castle loomed as a daily presence, part defense, part reminder of authority. Heraldry was another important symbol. Lords and knights displayed coats of arms, distinctive colors and designs painted on shields, banners, and clothing. These designs were not decoration alone, they carried meaning. They identified families, marked lineage, and served as visible signs of loyalty. In battle, a banner with a lord's arms rallied his men and signaled his command. In peacetime, those same arms decorated gates, documents, and seals, reinforcing ownership and identity. To see a coat of arms carved above a doorway or flying from a tower was to be reminded of who ruled. Ceremony and ritual also reinforced lordly power. The act of homage, where a vassal knelt before his lord, placed his hands between the lord's and swore loyalty, was both legal and symbolic. It dramatized the relationship of power, making it visible. Lords themselves performed such ceremonies before kings, repeating the chain of obligation. These acts reminded all present that society was built on layers of loyalty, binding men together under visible authority. Feasts and tournaments served a similar role. Lords hosted grand meals for vassals, clergy, and guests, filling great halls with food, drink, and music. These events were not only entertainment but demonstrations of wealth. A feast showed that the lord could provide abundance when peasants often struggled to eat enough. Tournaments, with jousts and contests, displayed martial power, giving knights a chance to perform skills before crowds. Both feasts and tournaments reminded communities of the resources and prestige their lord commanded. The clothing and lifestyle of lords were themselves symbolic. Fine garments of wool, linen, or imported silk set them apart from peasants in rough homespun. Jewelry, belts, and swords with decorated hilts were markers of rank. Even daily objects, goblets, furniture, books, could symbolize wealth and education. For visitors entering a lord's hall, every detail, from tapestries on the walls to servants at the table, reinforced the message of status. Religious symbols were equally powerful. Many lords built or endowed chapels and churches within their estates. These buildings carried carvings, stained glass, or inscriptions linking the family name with piety. Attending Mass at a chapel funded by the lord reminded peasants of his generosity and his closeness to God. Tombs, effigies, and memorials inside churches further proclaimed the lord's enduring presence, ensuring his name and lineage were remembered long after death. Even the language of documents carried symbolic weight. Charters and legal records were sealed with wax imprints of the lord's arms. Letters carried elaborate titles, naming the lord as protector, defender, or patron. These symbols on paper gave permanence to authority, spreading its reach beyond the manor into towns, markets, and distant lands. Small, everyday symbols also mattered. The right to hold a market cross in a village square marked the lord's permission to trade. Toll booths at bridges carried his insignia, showing his control over movement. Even coins, where lords had minting rights, bore their images or symbols, reminding every person who spent them of the power behind the economy. Together, these symbols formed a landscape of authority. Castles dominated skylines, banners marked ownership, courts enacted rituals, and churches carried reminders of patronage. For peasants, knights, and even rival nobles, these signs made the lord's position seem permanent and unshakable. Authority was not only enforced through soldiers or rents, but displayed in stone, cloth, and ceremony, woven into the very fabric of daily life. In this way, symbols of authority were as important as weapons or laws. They made power visible, constant, and unavoidable. Even in times of peace, when no battles were fought and no disputes judged, the castle walls, the coat of arms, and the feast in the hall spoke wordlessly of the lord's dominance. Through these symbols, lords turned abstract power into something concrete, surrounding their people with reminders of who ruled. Power in the Middle Ages was rarely held alone. Even the wealthiest lord could not exist in isolation. His strength depended not only on his own lands, soldiers, and wealth, but also on the connections he built with other families and other lords. These connections came most often through alliances and marriages, which turned private households into parts of much larger networks of influence. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not simply a personal matter of affection. For noble families, it was a tool of politics, designed to secure more land, form bonds with allies, or settle disputes with rivals. The joining of two families through marriage could mean the merging of estates, the strengthening of claims to titles, or the creation of mutual obligations between lords. A carefully chosen marriage could expand a family's wealth and influence as surely as a victory in battle. Daughters were often married off to neighboring lords, knights, or even higher-ranking nobles, forming ties of loyalty and cooperation. These unions created bonds that reached beyond blood, weaving webs of alliance that connected estates across regions. A marriage could turn potential rivals into kin, making conflict less likely and cooperation more natural. In some cases, disputes over land were resolved not by war, but by arranging a marriage that united the claims of two families. Sons, too, carried the family's interests forward. A younger son might be married into a wealthy heiress's estate, bringing new lands under the lord's control. Inheritance practices, where the eldest son often received the main estate, made such marriages crucial for younger sons to maintain influence and wealth. Through these unions, lords ensured that their families continued to thrive even as generations passed. Marriage was also tied to dynasty and continuity. By marrying strategically, lords secured the future of their line. Producing heirs was vital, for without a legitimate successor, estates could fragment or pass to distant relatives. Families carefully arranged unions to strengthen claims and ensure that lands remained under the control of their bloodline. The birth of children from these marriages was celebrated not only as personal joy, but as the preservation of authority. Alliances went beyond marriage as well. Lords often entered into formal agreements of friendship and support, sealed by oaths, ceremonies, or shared obligations. These alliances provided military assistance in times of conflict, trade advantages in times of peace, and collective strength against rivals. A single lord acting alone might be vulnerable, but several lords united through alliance could resist even kings. Feasts, tournaments, and shared religious patronage often served as the stage for building such ties. By inviting neighboring lords to dine, compete, or pray together, a noble demonstrated generosity and reinforced bonds. These gatherings were not simply social events. They were opportunities to strengthen networks of trust and loyalty that might be called upon in times of crisis. Marriage and alliance also connected lords to the royal court. A marriage into a family close to the king could bring favor, offices, or new grants of land. Lords who positioned their families near the crown through marriage gained more than kinship. They gained influence over national politics. The fortunes of entire regions could shift based on a single union approved or arranged by the king. At the same time, these strategies carried risks. Marriage could also bring disputes if inheritances overlapped or claims were contested. Alliances could shift, as families found new opportunities or broke old bonds. Yet even with risks, marriage and alliance remained central tools of power. They extended a lord's reach beyond his walls and fields, tying him into a web of kinship that stretched across medieval society. For peasants, these unions might seem distant, but they had real effects. A marriage that united two estates could mean new obligations, changes in lordship, or shifts in local authority. For lords, however, such unions were vital strategies, securing peace, strengthening power, and preserving authority across generations. In this way, alliances and marriage acted as invisible threads, holding together the structure of medieval politics. Castles showed power, armies enforced it, and courts administered it, but families preserved it. The careful weaving of marriages and alliances ensured that the power of lords did not vanish with a single life, but endured through generations, carried forward by heirs and strengthened by kin. Although medieval lords held immense power, their position was never entirely secure. The authority they enjoyed rested on land, armies, laws, and symbols. But each of these could be tested by forces beyond their control. Maintaining power meant more than simply holding castles and collecting rents. It also meant adapting to the constant challenges of war, politics, economy, and the lives of the people they ruled. One of the most common challenges came from rival lords. In many regions, noble families competed with one another for land, influence, or prestige. A border dispute between two manors could lead to skirmishes. Rivalries between greater nobles could erupt into full-scale wars, drawing in vassals and peasants alike. In such conflicts, a lord's power could be expanded or diminished in a matter of months. To survive, lords needed not only strength but careful diplomacy, forming alliances and balancing enmities to avoid being isolated. Another challenge was rebellion from below. Peasants, who bore the weight of rents, dues, and labor services, occasionally rose in resistance. While most of these uprisings were small and quickly crushed, they revealed the fragility of lordly power. A manor depended on the obedience of its workers. If too many resisted at once, fields went untended, rents went unpaid, and wealth dried up. Larger uprisings, such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, showed that peasant anger could threaten entire regions. Lords had to balance demands, sometimes easing burdens or negotiating settlements, to prevent unrest from spreading. The church also posed challenges. While religion strengthened lordly authority, the church itself was a powerful landholder and rival. Bishops and abbots often acted like lords, commanding vassals, holding courts, and collecting rents. At times, disputes arose over tithes, lands, or rights. A lord who clashed with the church risked not only political opposition but also spiritual consequences. Excommunication, the denial of sacraments, could undermine his legitimacy in the eyes of his people. Thus, lords had to navigate a careful relationship with the clergy, balancing cooperation with independence. Warfare itself created pressures. Maintaining knights, soldiers, and castles was costly. Campaigns demanded food, equipment, and coin. A long war could drain a lord's treasury, forcing him to increase rents or sell land. Defeat in battle could be even worse, losing land to rivals, paying ransoms if captured, or seeing his castle besieged and destroyed. Victory brought glory, but failure could unravel a family's power. This constant risk made military preparedness both essential and exhausting. The economy presented another challenge. Harvest failures, famine, and disease could devastate a lord's estates. If peasants starved or fled, rents and labor services vanished. The Black Death of the 14th century, which killed vast numbers of peasants, reshaped the balance of power between lords and workers. With fewer peasants available, survivors could demand better conditions, higher wages, or freedom from certain obligations. Lords who refused faced labor shortages, while those who adapted sometimes preserved their estates more successfully. Even within noble families, challenges arose. Inheritance disputes could fracture estates. If a lord died without a clear heir, lands might be divided, weakening the family's influence. Younger sons, left without major inheritances, sometimes became rivals themselves, serving other lords or turning to the church. Daughters' marriages could shift lands into the control of other families, altering the balance of power. Lords had to plan carefully to preserve their lineage, arranging marriages and titles to maintain continuity. Despite these difficulties, lords found ways to adapt. They strengthened ties through alliances, balanced rents with concessions, and embraced new military and economic practices. Some commuted labor services into money rents, giving peasants more flexibility while securing reliable income. Others invested in trade, towns, or markets, diversifying wealth beyond agriculture. Militarily, lords adopted new weapons and fortifications, adjusting to the changing nature of warfare. Adaptation was not always smooth, and not every lord succeeded. Families rose and fell, estates expanded and contracted, and fortunes shifted over time. But those who managed to adjust to the challenges of their age endured, passing on their lands and titles to new generations. The ability to adapt was as crucial as the ability to rule, for power that did not bend risked being broken. When we step back and look at the medieval world as a whole, it becomes clear that lords were the backbone of society. Kings may have worn crowns, and peasants may have tilled the fields, but it was the lords who connected these two extremes. They formed the middle layer of authority that kept the system working. Their castles dotted the landscape, their courts dispensed justice, their soldiers defended lands, and their wealth supported both local communities and the greater powers of kings and kingdoms. The power of lords was deeply rooted in land. Land fed people, produced wealth, and supported armies. But it was not just the soil itself, it was everything tied to it. The peasants who worked it, the villages that grew upon it, and the rents and services that flowed from it. Land was the thread that linked economy, law, and loyalty together. Without it, there could be no lordship. With it, lords held authority that lasted for centuries. Lords also served as local rulers in a time when kings were often distant figures. For most peasants, the king was someone they had never seen, whose name they might only hear at festivals or in prayers. The Lord, by contrast, was ever present. He judged disputes, collected rents, and protected villages with his soldiers and castles. To live in the Middle Ages was to live under the shadow of a local lord's authority. For better or worse, he was the figure who shaped daily life more directly than any king. Their power was reinforced by many pillars at once. Military strength gave them force, law gave them legitimacy, economic control gave them wealth, religion gave them divine sanction, and symbols gave them visibility. No single element stood alone. Together, they formed a web of authority that surrounded everyone within a lord's domain. A peasant working the fields, a knight serving in battle, or a priest saying mass in a village chapel, all operated within a framework upheld by the lord's power. At the same time, lords were not all powerful. They faced challenges from every direction: rival nobles seeking to expand, peasants resisting heavy burdens, kings demanding loyalty, and the church asserting spiritual authority. Their position was strong but never absolute. What made their rule endure was their ability to adapt, to negotiate alliances, to shift economic practices, to invest in new forms of defense, and to balance authority with obligation. The legacy of lords is visible even today. Many castles still stand, reminders of their dominance over landscapes and communities. Fields and villages in Europe still follow patterns laid down in the Middle Ages, shaped by the manorial system. Heraldic symbols, once used to mark authority, survive in family crests, city emblems, and national coats of arms. Even the traditions of courts, parliaments, and local governance trace their roots back to the way lords exercised authority over their estates. It is easy to focus on kings and great battles when studying the Middle Ages, but in truth, the day-to-day survival of medieval society rested with lords. They collected the rents that funded armies, they commanded the knights who fought wars, they built the castles that guarded regions, and they enforced the laws that structured village life. Without them, the system would have collapsed. For peasants, life under a lord could feel burdensome, filled with obligations, dues, and limited freedoms. Yet lords also provided protection in a dangerous world, offering shelter from raids, conflict, and famine. For kings, lords were both supporters and rivals, men who could provide soldiers for royal campaigns, but who could also challenge the crown's authority if they grew too strong. For the church, lords were patrons, donors, and sometimes competitors, shaping the spiritual as well as the political landscape. In the bigger picture, lords were not simply individuals, but part of a network of power that defined the medieval age. Their authority was local, but collectively, their influence stretched across kingdoms. They stood at the crossroads of war and peace, law and custom, faith and survival. They maintained power not through a single tool, but through a careful balance of land, loyalty, force, wealth, and faith. The story of medieval lords is therefore the story of stability and endurance. For centuries, through wars, plagues, and upheavals, their castles stood, their courts met, and their peasants worked the land. Their world was not without change, but the structure of lordship gave the Middle Ages its distinctive rhythm, a rhythm marked by fields tilled, rents collected, knights summoned, and prayers offered. When the Middle Ages gradually gave way to new eras, to stronger monarchies, to growing towns, to different economies, the role of lords changed. But during the centuries of feudal society, they remained at the center of power. Their influence was written not only in chronicles, but also in the very landscape, in the patterns of villages, the ruins of castles, and the traditions of governance that still echo today. In the end, medieval lords maintained power not because they were unchallenged, but because they built systems of control that were flexible, layered, and deeply rooted in the land itself. Their castles, courts, and customs stood as reminders to all who lived under them that authority was not fleeting. It was enduring, reinforced daily by work, ritual, and loyalty. And in that endurance lies their true significance in the history of the Middle Ages. The morning mist still clung to the low-lying meadows as the first rays of sunlight began to crest over the eastern hills, casting long shadows from the tall oaks that dotted the landscape. In the great stone keep, the lord of the manor was already awake, his day beginning long before most of his subjects had stirred from their slumber. This was not a time of idleness or indulgence, but one of immense responsibility and deliberate action. The maintenance of power in the medieval world was a subtle, complex art, a delicate dance of strength and generosity, authority and compassion, tradition and innovation. It was a balance that required constant attention, a deep understanding of human nature, and an unwavering commitment to the land and the people who depended on it for their survival. To understand how these figures, these medieval lords, held on to their power, is to understand the very fabric of society itself, a tapestry woven from loyalty, land, and law. The foundation of a lord's power, the very bedrock upon which his entire world was built, was the land itself. The estate, the manor, the domain, these were not merely properties to be owned, but living, breathing entities that sustained hundreds of lives. The Lord did not simply rule over the land, he was a part of it, and his primary duty was its stewardship. This began with an intimate knowledge of every acre, every field, every stream, and every wood. He knew which fields yielded the best barley, which pastures were sweetest for the sheep, which woods held the strongest timber for building, and where the game was most plentiful for the hunt. This knowledge was not acquired from a ledger or a map alone, but from countless hours spent riding across his domain, his eyes missing no detail, his mind constantly calculating and planning for the seasons ahead. The successful harvest was not just a matter of wealth, it was a matter of survival for the entire community. A poor harvest meant hunger, discontent, and a weakening of his position. Therefore, the wise Lord invested heavily in the productivity of his land, improving plows, clearing new fields, and ensuring the intricate system of crop rotation was followed with precision. His power was directly proportional to the fertility of his soil and the well-being of the livestock that grazed upon it. The land was his bank, his larder, and his throne, all in one. But land, on its own, is inert. Its true value is unlocked by the people who work it. The feudal system was a pyramid of mutual obligation, a grand bargain between the Lord and his people. At its heart was the concept of loyalty, a bond that was both personal and legal. The peasants, the serfs, the free tenants, they pledged their labor and their service to the Lord. In return, he pledged his protection and his justice. This was not a one-sided relationship of oppression, as it is sometimes simplistically portrayed, but a symbiotic partnership. The Lord's power was secure only so long as he upheld his end of this ancient bargain. His strength was their strength. His security was their security. If a neighboring lord threatened raid, it was his walls they fled behind. If a dispute arose between tenants over the boundaries of a field, it was his court that provided a resolution. If a widow was left destitute, it was often from his granary that a measure of grain was given to see her through the winter. These acts of justice and charity were not mere kindness. They were essential investments in the stability of his rule. A lord who was seen as fair, who dispensed justice without favoritism, and who provided for his people in times of need, earned a loyalty that was far more powerful than any fear he could instill through force alone. This loyalty was the glue that held the manor together, the invisible force that maintained order and productivity. The visible symbol of this protective power was the castle or the manor house. These stone fortresses were not just homes. They were statements of authority, centers of administration, and refuges in times of trouble. The construction and maintenance of a castle was a colossal undertaking, a continuous project that employed stonemasons, carpenters, and laborers for years, even decades. Its imposing walls and high towers served as a constant daily reminder of the Lord's presence and his strength. It was a deterrent to any would-be aggressor, a clear signal that this land was defended. But within those walls, the castle was also the beating heart of the manor's economy and social life. The Great Hall was where the Lord held his court, settling disputes and receiving petitions. It was where communal meals were sometimes held, reinforcing the bonds of community. The castle's storerooms held the surplus grain that was the insurance policy against famine. Its armory held the weapons that would be distributed to the men of the manor in times of conflict. The castle was, therefore, both a shield and a hub, a place of safety and a place of business. The Lord's ability to command the resources to build and maintain such a structure was in itself a powerful demonstration of his control over men and materials. Yet, physical strength and a well-stocked granary were only part of the equation. A lord's power was also deeply rooted in tradition and the perceived natural order of the world. Medieval society was profoundly hierarchical and religious. It was widely believed that God had ordained a specific place for everyone, from the highest king to the lowliest serf. The lord's position at the top of the local hierarchy was seen as part of God's plan. He was not just a political leader, he was a spiritual figurehead. He patronized the local church, ensuring its upkeep and supporting its priest. He led his household in prayer and was expected to set a moral example. His participation in religious ceremonies, his gifts to the church, and his public displays of piety reinforced the idea that his rule was legitimate and blessed by divine authority. To challenge the Lord was not merely to challenge a man, it was to challenge the very order of the universe as it was understood. This ideological framework was a powerful tool for maintaining the status quo. It encouraged acceptance and discouraged ambition that might disrupt the social harmony. The Lord, by embodying this ideal of pious, noble leadership, wrapped his temporal power in a cloak of spiritual sanction. Of course, the medieval world was not a peaceful paradise. Threats were constant, both from outside and from within. A lord's power depended fundamentally on his military prowess. He was, first and foremost, a warrior. His training began in boyhood, mastering the skills of horsemanship, swordsmanship, and strategy. His ability to lead men in battle was the ultimate test of his fitness to rule. His power allowed him to raise a force from among his tenants, men who owed him military service as part of their feudal obligations. He maintained a corps of household knights and men-at-arms, professional soldiers who were loyal to him personally. This military force was used to defend the manor from external threats, but it was also the ultimate enforcer of his will internally. The specter of force was always present, the final argument in any dispute. However, the wise lord knew that ruling through fear alone was a brittle strategy. An army could crush a rebellion, but it could not till the fields or shear the sheep. Military strength was the iron fist, but it worked best when concealed within the velvet glove of justice and good lordship. It was the guarantee of the system, the power that underpinned all the other softer forms of influence, but it was not the system itself. Beyond the boundaries of his own manor, a lord's power was negotiated within a wider web of relationships with his peers and his own overlord. He was both a ruler and a vassal. He held his land from a higher noble, perhaps a count or a duke, or even directly from the king. To this overlord, he owed military service, counsel, and financial aid. This relationship was another delicate balance. A lord needed to be strong enough to maintain his autonomy and command respect from his peers, but not so strong that he became a threat to his overlord. Alliances were forged through marriage, through oaths of fealty, and through mutual self-interest. A lord spent a great deal of time and energy managing these external relationships, attending the court of his overlord, acting as a judge in the courts of his peers, and negotiating treaties and marriages. His power on the local stage was amplified or diminished by his standing on this larger regional stage. A lord who was respected at court could call upon powerful friends in a crisis. A lord who was isolated or in dispute with his overlord could find his authority undermined and his lands threatened. Politics, therefore, was as much a part of a lord's life as agriculture or warfare. The daily administration of the manor was a monumental task that required a sophisticated system of record-keeping and management. The lord relied on a small army of officials to make this system work. The steward was his chief administrator, a man of learning and trust who oversaw the entire estate in the lord's name, traveling between manors to audit accounts and ensure the bailiffs were honest. The bailiff was a local official who managed the day-to-day business of the home farm, directing the labor of the peasants and keeping detailed records of planting, harvests, and livestock. The reeve, often a peasant elected by his fellows, acted as an intermediary between the lord and the villagers, responsible for organizing the work gangs and ensuring labor obligations were met. This bureaucracy, though primitive by modern standards, was essential. It allowed the lord to extract the wealth from his lands efficiently through rents, taxes, and the profits of his domain fields. Detailed accounts were kept on parchment rolls, noting every bushel of grain owed, every day of labor performed, every piglet born. This information was power. It allowed the lord to plan, too. The clatter of hooves on cobblestone echoed through the narrow streets of York as the royal messenger spurred his lathered horse onward, the animal's breath pluming in the frigid morning air like a dragon's. He carried not just a sealed parchment, but the simmering tensions of a kingdom fraying at the seams. It was the year 1399, and the iron grip of the Plantagenet dynasty, which had held England for over 2 centuries, was beginning to slip. The messenger's destination was the great fortified complex of Pontefract Castle, a grim stone sentinel in West Yorkshire, and his message was for the man imprisoned within its deepest, most lightless oubliette, the deposed King Richard II. Richard, once the radiant sun around which the entire court orbited, now existed in a world of perpetual twilight. The chill of the stone walls seeped into his bones, a cold far deeper than any winter's frost. It was the cold of betrayal, of power lost, of a divine right violently revoked. He could still recall the opulence of his court, the shimmer of silk and gold thread under countless candles, the heady scent of incense and spiced wine. He saw himself, a young king crowned at just 10 years old, the heavy gold of Edward the Confessor's crown pressing upon his brow, a weight he had believed was his by God's own design. His reign had been a tapestry of immense beauty and profound tragedy, woven with threads of artistic patronage, architectural ambition, and a fatal misreading of the powerful men who surrounded him. His mind, in the solitude of his cell, drifted back to the golden days of his personal rule. After shaking off the controlling influence of his uncle, John of Gaunt, and the other appellant lords who had sought to make him a puppet, Richard had embarked on a project of magnificent kingship. He was not a warrior king like his grandfather, Edward III, or the Black Prince. His currency was not martial glory but splendor. He rebuilt Westminster Hall into the grandest ceremonial space in Christendom, its magnificent hammer-beam roof a testament to his vision, a vast timber-vaulted heaven meant to awe any subject who entered. He patronized the arts, surrounding himself with poets and painters, fostering a culture of refined elegance that stood in stark contrast to the brutish world of the feudal barons. He even commissioned his own majestic portrait, the Wilton Diptych, a stunning piece of art that depicted him surrounded by saints, receiving the blessing of the Christ child himself, a clear statement of his piety and his belief in his own divinely sanctioned authority. But this very splendor sowed the seeds of discontent. The great magnates of the realm, men of sword and shield, viewed his court with deep suspicion. To them this was not culture, it was decadence. His reliance on a small circle of favorites, men like Robert de Vere, whom he made Duke of Ireland, was seen as a dangerous corruption of the natural order. The vast sums of money spent on his artistic projects and his lavish court were resented, especially as the kingdom was still feeling the financial strain of the ongoing and increasingly feudal 100 Years' War with France. The poll taxes he levied to fund these ventures fell heaviest on the poorest, sparking the embers of the peasants' revolt in 1381. A fire that had nearly consumed his throne before he quelled it with a startling mix of courage and cunning, promising reforms to the rebel army before brutally reneging once the danger had passed. The final crisis, the one that led to the messenger now hastening toward Pontefract, began with a seemingly minor feudal dispute. It involved Thomas de Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk, and Henry of Bolingbroke, the son of the powerful John of Gaunt. The two nobles levied accusations of treason against one another, and Richard, in a move he likely thought would demonstrate his ultimate authority, decided to settle the matter through a trial by combat. The stage was set at Coventry. The air crackled with anticipation as two of the kingdom's greatest knights prepared to do battle, their polished plate armor gleaming under the sun, their chargers snorting and stamping. The crowds gathered, nobles and commoners alike, eager for the spectacle. But at the very last moment, as the heralds were about to signal the charge, Richard threw down his baton and stopped the contest. In a stunning pronouncement, he banished both men from the kingdom, Mowbray for life, Bolingbroke for 10 years. It was a masterstroke of political theater, a breathtaking display of royal power. The king could, with a mere gesture, alter the destinies of the highest men in the land. But it was also a catastrophic miscalculation. The banishment was seen as arbitrary, unjust, and a violation of the noble right to settle grievances by combat. It created a deep and lasting wound in the body politic. The wound festered, and when John of Gaunt, the king's uncle and the bedrock of the Lancastrian affinity, died the following year, Richard saw an opportunity. In an act of staggering financial and political short-sightedness, he seized the vast Lancastrian estates that were rightfully Bolingbroke's inheritance, using the revenues to fund a military campaign in Ireland. He had not just banished a noble, he had disinherited one, violating the most sacred principle of land and lineage that underpinned the entire feudal system. This was the spark. Henry Bolingbroke, now the wronged Duke of Lancaster, did not accept his fate. While Richard was across the Irish Sea, battling chieftains in the damp, tangled woods of Ireland, Bolingbroke returned to England. He landed at Ravenspur on the Yorkshire coast with a small force, claiming he had come only to reclaim his stolen inheritance. It was a brilliantly calculated lie. The kingdom, simmering with resentment against Richard's heavy-handed and expensive rule, did not rise to defend their king. Instead, they flocked to Bolingbroke's banner. One by one, the great towns and castles of England opened their gates to him. The tide of support was overwhelming, a torrent that Richard, returning too late from Ireland, found himself utterly powerless to stem. The king's final days of freedom were a pathetic mirror of his former glory. He was captured in Conwy Castle, isolated and abandoned by almost all his supporters. The once proud monarch was transported to London, not as a ruler but as a prisoner, forced to ride through the same streets that had once cheered his name. He was taken to the Tower, that ancient symbol of royal power, which now became his gilded cage. There, in a dimly lit chamber, he was presented with a document listing 33 articles of deposition. He was forced to read them aloud, to confess to his own alleged crimes and inadequacies, his tyranny, his vanity, his squandering of the realm's treasure. It was a ritual humiliation designed to break not just his power, but his spirit. With a trembling hand, it is said, he signed his own abdication, the ink on the parchment a stark black testament to the end of his line. The crown, that sacred object he believed was his by God's will, was passed to his cousin, who ascended the throne as Henry IV. And so Richard found himself here, in the damp darkness of Pontefract, a forgotten man in a forgotten cell. The world outside had moved on. A new king held court at Westminster. New favorites jostled for position. The rhythms of life, the planting and the harvest, the markets and the fairs, continued, the realm adapting to its new master with the pragmatic resilience of the common folk. But within these thick walls, time had stopped. His existence was reduced to the four walls of his cell, the rough texture of his woolen tunic, the meager fare of bread and thin pottage, and the constant gnawing memory of what had been. The sound of the bolt sliding back was a shock in the profound silence, a screech of iron on iron that echoed like a scream. The heavy oak door groaned open, and torchlight flooded the cell, so painfully bright that Richard had to shield his eyes with a thin, pale hand. The figure of the constable of the castle filled the doorway, his expression unreadable in the flickering shadows. Behind him stood the royal messenger, his clothes still dusty from the road, his face grim. "A message from the king," the constable announced, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Richard said nothing. He merely looked up, his eyes slowly adjusting to the light. He knew with a cold certainty that settled in his stomach that this was no ordinary message. Henry IV, the usurper, would not be sending him letters of goodwill. The new king's reign was still fresh, its foundations shaky. Rebellions were already bubbling up in various corners of the kingdom, all of them flying the banner of the deposed Richard. As long as Richard lived, he was a threat. He was a symbol, a cause, a ghost that would not be laid to rest. The messenger stepped forward, holding out the rolled parchment. He did not offer it for Richard to take. He simply held it, as if the very act of handing it to the prisoner was beneath his station. The wax seal was large and red, impressed with the new royal arms of Lancaster. It was unbroken. "You are to read it," the constable said, his tone leaving no room for question. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he reached out. His fingers, once adorned with heavy rings, were now bare and thin. He took the clang of steel echoed through the mist-shrouded valleys as the Norman knights advanced, their chainmail glinting like 1,000 malevolent fireflies in the weak morning light. Each hoofbeat of their massive destriers seemed to pound the very earth into submission, a rhythmic declaration of conquest that resonated through the ancient English soil. William the Conqueror, his face set in grim determination beneath his nasal helm, surveyed the ridge where Harold's housecarls stood shoulder to shoulder, their round shields overlapping to form an impenetrable wall of oak and iron. The air itself seemed to thicken with the tension of impending violence, carrying the scent of damp wool, cold sweat, and the metallic tang of fear that precedes great slaughter. From the English lines came the low, guttural chanting of battle prayers, interwoven with the sharper commands of Vixens positioning their men. Harold Godwinson stood resplendent in his royal armor, the golden boar of Wessex gleaming upon his helmet, though his face bore the weary marks of a man who had already fought one great battle and marched his army nearly 200 miles to face this new threat. The crown felt heavy upon his brow, not merely as gold and jewels, but as the weight of a kingdom's fate. He watched the Norman archers notch their arrows, the cavalry shifting into formation, and knew that the destiny of England would be decided here upon this ridge between the forest and the marsh, where the very contours of the land favored the defender. Then came the first flight of arrows, a dark swarm rising from the Norman lines with a sound like a sudden gust through dead leaves. They climbed, seemed to hang for a terrifying moment against the leaden sky, then descended with lethal purpose. Shields raised as one along the English line, the thudding impact like hail upon 1,000 roofs. Here and there a man fell with a choked cry, an arrow finding the gap between shield and helm, but the wall held. No sooner had the arrows struck than the Norman infantry began their advance up the slope, their boots churning the already muddy ground. They came not with the wild rush of barbarians, but with the disciplined tread of professional soldiers, their formation tight, their pace measured behind a wall of painted shields. The first collision was a cataclysm of splintering wood and shrieking metal. The English battle axes rose and fell with terrible efficiency, hacking through Norman shields and the arms that held them. The housecarls, these giant men from the north, fought with the cold fury of those defending their very homes, their two-handed axes carving ghastly arcs through the press of attackers. For a moment it seemed the Norman advance would break upon this wall of English steel like waves upon a cliff. But William had not become Duke of Normandy through brute force alone. His was a mind that calculated angles of attack and weaknesses of morale. Seeing his infantry struggling against the ferocious defense, William signaled his cavalry. With a great shout and the blaring of horns, the Norman knights urged their war horses up the slope. The ground trembled beneath their charge, a sensation that traveled through the earth and up the legs of the English defenders. The housecarls braced, locking shields even tighter, presenting a hedge of spear points toward the approaching horsemen. The impact was devastating. Horses screamed as they impaled themselves on the English spears. Riders were thrown from their saddles to be swallowed by the press of infantry. Yet still the knights came, wave after wave, testing the English line for weakness. It was during one such assault that a cry went up from the Norman left. A rumor spread like wildfire that Duke William had fallen. Panic began to seize the Norman forces, their advance faltering as men looked about for leadership. But William, quick-witted and recognizing the danger, tore off his helmet and rode along the lines, his face visible to all. "I live," he shouted, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "See me and fight on. God favors our cause." The sight of their leader, unharmed and defiant, reinvigorated the Normans. Their attacks renewed with even greater ferocity. Now William employed cunning stratagem. He ordered his Breton troops on the left flank to feign retreat, a tactic they executed with convincing terror, breaking ranks and fleeing down the slope. A great roar went up from the English right, where the less disciplined fired troops saw what they believed to be a rout. Forgetting Harold's strict orders to hold the shield wall, they broke formation and gave chase, thinking to turn the Norman retreat into a massacre. But it was a trap. As the English streamed down the hill in disorganized pursuit, the Norman cavalry wheeled about and cut them off from the main force. What followed was not battle but butchery. The Bretons turned on their pursuers, the cavalry charged into their flanks, and in minutes the entire English right was surrounded and systematically destroyed. The tragedy repeated itself not long after on the English left, where another feigned retreat drew more of Harold's forces from their defensive position. Each time, the disciplined Norman knights demonstrated their superiority in mobile warfare against an army that fought best from a fixed position. The great shield wall, once unbreakable, now showed dangerous gaps where men had fallen or foolishly abandoned their posts. The Norman archers, their quivers nearly emptied, launched their arrows high into the air to fall almost vertically upon the English rear, where Harold and his housecarls still held the center. It was during this final barrage that fortune, which had smiled so briefly upon the English king, turned her face away forever. Contemporary accounts speak of the arrow that found its mark, though which Norman archer loosed it would never be known. The missile descended from the heavens as if guided by divine will, piercing Harold's eye and embedding itself deep in his brain. The king staggered, his battle-axe falling from nerveless fingers, and collapsed among his housecarls. A great cry of despair went up from the English. "The king is slain! The king is slain!" that spread like a plague through the weary ranks. What followed was not immediate surrender, but the death throes of an army that had lost its reason for fighting. The housecarls, those formidable warriors who had sworn to die with their weapons in hand rather than yield, closed around their fallen king's body and fought with the terrible strength of men who have nothing left to lose. They formed a shrinking circle of defiance as the Normans pressed in from all sides, hacking and hewing until their arms were too tired to lift their weapons. One by one they fell, until finally the last of Harold's bodyguard lay dead upon the ridge, their blood mingling with that of their king in the churned earth. William, surveying the field as the October light began to fade, knew he had won more than a battle. He had won a kingdom. But the cost was apparent on all sides. The ridge, which would come to be known as Senlac Hill, was littered with the dead and dying. Perhaps 6,000 men lay slaughtered in an area not much larger than a few acres. The groans of the wounded and the cries of the ravens already gathering in the twilight trees created a dreadful chorus. The Norman duke ordered a tent erected where the English standard had flown, and there he received the surrender of the surviving English nobles who had not fled the field. Yet even in victory, William's position remained precarious. He was a foreign conqueror in a land that had just witnessed the destruction of its native ruling class. The Witan, the council of elders that traditionally elected England's kings, had been decimated at Hastings. Many of its members lay dead upon the field. Those who survived would have to be coerced or convinced to accept Norman rule. William immediately set about securing his position, sending forces to seize key ports and strongholds while he advanced toward London. The march to London was not without opposition. The remaining English leaders gathered in the city and elected Edgar Atheling, the young grandson of Edmund Ironside, as king. For a brief moment, it seemed England might rally around this last scion of the ancient royal house of Wessex. But William's methodical advance, combined with his policy of devastating the countryside through which he passed, broke the will of the English resistance. When the Norman army reached Berkhamsted, the English leadership came to submit, Edgar himself among them. On Christmas Day of 1066, in Westminster Abbey, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England. The ceremony, intended to symbolize continuity and divine approval, nearly turned to catastrophe when the Norman guards outside, hearing the shouts of acclamation within the church in a language they did not understand, mistakenly believed their duke was under attack. They set fire to the surrounding buildings, causing panic among the congregation. Smoke drifted into the abbey as William, trembling but resolute, received the crown from the hands of the Archbishop of York. It was an ominous beginning to a reign that would forever alter the course of English history. The Norman conquest did not end with the coronation. For years afterward, William faced rebellions across his new kingdom. The north of England, always resistant to southern rule, rose in open revolt in 1069. William's response was the harrying of the north, a systematic campaign of destruction so thorough that decades later, the Domesday Book would record vast tracts of Yorkshire as waste. Villages were burned, livestock slaughtered, and fields salted. Thousands starved to death in the ensuing famine, and the region's resistance was broken forever in blood and ash. The changes wrought by the conquest permeated every aspect of English society. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost entirely dispossessed, their lands granted to Norman, Breton, and Flemish followers of William. The clang of steel echoed through the mist-shrouded valley, a discordant symphony of survival and ambition. As dawn's pale fingers stretched across the sky, they illuminated not just the dew on the grass, but the grim aftermath of a struggle that had raged through the night. The field was a tapestry of churned mud, discarded weaponry, and the still forms of those for whom the sun would never again rise. This was not merely a battle. It was a punctuation mark in the long, bloody sentence of a kingdom's history, a moment where the trajectory of power shifted on the edge of a sword. The air, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the smoky remnants of torches, carried the low groans of the wounded, a sound more haunting than any battle cry. Crows had already begun their grim work, their black forms stark against the gray morning, their cause a macabre commentary on the follies of men. On a slight rise overlooking the field, a figure on a massive destrier surveyed the scene. His armor, once polished to a brilliant silver, was now scarred, dented, and spattered with gore. The surcoat over it, bearing the crest of a golden lion rampant on a field of azure, was torn and muddied. This was Lord Godfrey of Hawksmere, his face a mask of exhaustion and hardened resolve beneath his raised visor. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the carnage not with triumph, but with a cold, calculating weight. Victory was his, but it was a fruit plucked from a poisoned tree. The army he had defeated was not that of a foreign invader, but that of his own liege lord, the Earl of Marchwood. This was rebellion, a high treason for which the price was often a traitor's death, unless the traitor proved strong enough to rewrite the laws himself. "My lord," a voice rasped beside him. Sir Alaric, his marshal, urged his own weary mount closer. Alaric's left arm was bound tightly in a crude sling, a dark stain seeping through the linen. "The Earl is taken. His personal guard fought to the last man, but we have him. He lives." Godfrey did not turn his head. His gaze remained fixed on the distant tree line where the remnants of the Earl's forces had fled into the shadows. And his son, Edmund? A hesitation, brief but telling, hung in the air. We have not found the body, my lord. He was seen leading a contingent of knights in a countercharge on the left flank when our lines buckled. After that, the chaos. He may have fallen among the unnamed dead, or he may have fled with the others. A low, guttural sound escaped Godfrey's lips. The cub escaped the trap. That is a problem that will grow teeth, Alaric. A problem for another day. He finally turned to his marshal, his expression grim. The living Earl is a problem for today. Bring him to me, and send riders to secure the castle. I want its gates open and its garrison disarmed before the sun reaches its zenith. Any man who resists is to be shown no mercy. As Alaric nodded and wheeled his horse away, shouting orders that were quickly taken up by lesser commanders, Godfrey allowed himself a single deep breath. The die was cast. There was no path back to fealty, no offering of excuses and bent knees that would satisfy the crown. The king, old and ailing in his capital far to the south, would hear of this insurrection soon enough. His response would be swift and brutal, an royal army marching to crush the upstart lord and make a bloody example of him. Godfrey's only chance, his only path to survival and perhaps even to a crown of his own, was to move faster, to be harder, to forge his rebellion into a new kingdom before the old order could muster its strength. This moment, this misty morning on a field of death, was the true beginning. The battle was over, but the war for the very soul of the realm had just begun. It was a war that would be fought not just with armies, but with diplomacy, with marriage alliances, with gold squeezed from merchants and peasants alike, and with the unyielding will of a man who had stared into the abyss of his own ambition and chosen to leap. The clanking of chains announced the arrival of the Earl. He was a proud man, Robert of Marchwood, but pride was a difficult thing to maintain when your hands were bound before you and your fine armor had been stripped away, leaving you in a stained tunic. He was bloodied, a cut above his eye still weeping crimson, but he held his head high, his eyes burning with a fury that could have kindled damp tinder. The soldiers flanking him shoved him forward, and he stumbled on the uneven ground before regaining his footing before Godfrey's horse. "Godfrey," the Earl spat the name as if it were a curse. "You snake, you viper nurtured at my own table. The king will hear of this. He will raise your holdings to the ground, salt your fields, and hang your corpse from the gates of Hawksmere for the crows." Godfrey looked down at him, his face an unreadable slab of stone. He slowly dismounted, his armor creaking with the movement. The act of standing before his captured lord, eye to eye, was itself a powerful statement. "The king is weak, Robert," Godfrey said, his voice low and devoid of the anger that colored the Earl's words. It was a voice of simple, cold fact. "He clutches his throne in Winchester while his barons squabble like dogs over a bone. He cannot protect his loyal subjects. He cannot keep the peace. Look around you." Godfrey gestured to the field of the dead. "This is the peace of the realm. This is what his weakness has wrought." "This is what your ambition has wrought," the Earl roared, straining against his bonds. "This treason, this butchery." "It is a new order," Godfrey replied calmly. "The old one is rotting from within. Someone must be strong enough to seize the reins before the entire cart plunges into the abyss. Marchwood is mine now. Your titles, your lands, your authority. I claim them by right of conquest. Your life, however, your life is still your own. For now." The Earl fell silent, his chest heaving. The reality of his situation was dawning, cutting through the blinding rage. He was not being paraded as a trophy. He was being given a choice. Godfrey was a pragmatist above all else. Killing a respected earl, even a defeated one, would create a martyr. Forcing his submission, however, would be a powerful symbol. "What are you proposing?" the Earl asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Swear fealty to me," Godfrey said. "Here and now, publicly, renounce your oath to the weakling king, and pledge yourself to me as the rightful lord of the northern marches. Do this, and you will keep your life. You will be granted a minor keep and enough land to live out your days in comfort, if not in power. Your wife and daughters will be unharmed. They will retain their honor." The Earl stared aghast. "You ask me to betray my sworn king? To become an oath-breaker? To live in shame as a guest in my own former hall? You might as well ask the sun to rise in the west." Godfrey took a step closer. "I am asking you to be sensible. The king you swore to is a ghost. The power in this land is here." He tapped his own chest plate. "Your alternative is to die as a loyal fool, and your family will share your fate. Your wife will be cast out, your daughters will be married off to my lowest-born knights, and the name of Marchwood will be erased from memory. The choice is simple, Robert. Honor in death and oblivion for your line, or shame in life and its continuation. The future is a ruthless country. One must pack accordingly." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the moan of the wind and the distant calls of the crows. The Earl's shoulders, which had been held so rigidly straight, seemed to slump under an immense invisible weight. He was broken, not just in body, but in spirit. He looked past Godfrey, his eyes scanning the field where so many of his men who had trusted him, now lay dead for a cause that was already lost. He looked at the faces of Godfrey's soldiers, hard, victorious, loyal to the man who offered them plunder and power. He saw the future in their eyes, and it was bleak for holdouts of the old world. His voice, when it finally came, was a broken whisper, stripped of all its former fire. "And you swear? On your soul? You swear my family will be safe?" "On my soul and on my hope of heaven," Godfrey said, though the words sounded hollow, a necessary formality rather than a sacred oath. "They will be safe, you have my word." The Earl closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He nodded once, a short, sharp gesture of utter defeat. Then I so swear. I, Robert of Marchwood, renounce my oath to King Alaric and pledge my fealty. To you, Godfrey of Hawksmere, as my liege lord. The words tasted. The clatter of hooves on cobblestone echoed through the narrow streets of York as the royal procession made its way toward the towering minster. King Edward III, his face set in grim determination beneath a jeweled crown, rode at the forefront, the weight of a kingdom pressing upon his armored shoulders. It was the year of our Lord 1337, and the air itself seemed to crackle with the tension of impending conflict. The scent of wood smoke and roasting meats from the street vendors' stalls did little to mask the underlying odor of fear and anticipation that clung to the city like a morning mist. Banners bearing the golden lions of England snapped in the brisk autumn wind, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray stone of the buildings that lined the route. From the crowded thoroughfares, faces peered out from beneath hoods and shawls, merchants with their ledgers clutched tightly, blacksmiths with arms still smudged from the forge, mothers holding children close. Their eyes, wide with a mixture of awe and trepidation, followed the progress of their king. They knew, as all of England knew, that the long shadow of war was falling across the land once more. The fragile peace with France, maintained through years of tense diplomacy and strategic marriages, had finally shattered. The cause? A dispute over the ancient Duchy of Guienne, a slice of French territory that had been in English hands for generations, and the thorny, ever-present issue of the French crown itself, which Edward, through his mother Isabella, claimed as his rightful inheritance. The roots of this conflict, which would come to be known as the 100 Years' War, stretched back decades, even centuries, into the tangled past of these two mighty kingdoms. It was a feud born of blood ties and broken oaths, of competing national identities slowly hardening like clay in a kiln. The Capetian line of France had died out, and the Valois dynasty had seized the throne. But Edward III, Plantagenet King of England, grandson of the formidable Philip IV of France through his mother, saw himself not as a mere claimant, but as the legitimate heir. He would not bow to a usurper. This was not merely a squabble over land. It was a matter of sacred honor, of divine right, and the very soul of a nation finding its voice. Inside the great minster, the air was thick with incense and the low, resonant chant of monks. Sunlight, fractured by the magnificent stained glass, painted the cold stone floor in hues of sapphire, ruby, and gold. Edward dismounted, his plate armor glinting in the multicolored light, and strode toward the high altar. Here, before God and his assembled barons and bishops, he would formally declare his intention to press his claim. The Archbishop of York, resplendent in his vestments, awaited him, his face a mask of solemn piety. The ceremony was not just a declaration. It was a ritual of binding, a sacred commitment that would mobilize the entire feudal might of England. Let it be known to all present and to all Christendom, the king's herald's voice boomed through the vast nave, silencing the choir, that Edward, by the grace of God, King of England and France, and Lord of Ireland, does hereby renounce his homage to Philip of Valois, whom he holds to be a false king and a usurper of the most sacred throne of France. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation, followed by a surge of fervent whispers. The claim to the French title was audacious, a direct and unforgivable insult to the Valois monarchy. It was a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge that could only be answered with the sword. The die was cast. The path ahead was paved with the promise of glory and the certainty of bloodshed. The news did not take long to cross the Channel. In the royal court at Paris, in the splendid halls of the Louvre, King Philip VI received the English defiance with cold fury. The messenger who delivered the scroll bearing Edward's seal trembled under the king's gaze. Philip, a man known for his chivalric bearing and volatile temper, slowly rose from his throne. The courtiers fell into a dead silence. "So," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "the wolf pup of Isabella fancies himself a lion. He forgets his place. He forgets that France is not some petty island to be claimed by a upstart with a tenuous drop of Capetian blood." He crumpled the parchment in his mailed fist. "If it is war the Plantagenet desires, then by God, he shall have it." and he shall learn the price of his arrogance on the fields of France. The machinery of two nations began to grind into motion. It was a colossal undertaking, a feat of logistics and mobilization that would test the limits of medieval administration. In England, royal clerks worked by flickering candlelight, drafting commissions of array that were dispatched to every shire. Sheriffs and bailiffs read the proclamations in market squares from Cornwall to Northumberland, calling upon all men of fighting age and sufficient means to muster with their required arms and armor. The sound of hammers on anvils became the soundtrack of the realm, as smiths worked day and night to forge swords, spearheads, and thousands of arrowheads. In ports like Southampton, Bristol, and London, the wharves teemed with activity as ships were requisitioned and converted into transports for men, horses, and the vast quantities of supplies needed to sustain an army on foreign soil. This was not the war of the old feudal levy, where a king called his tenants-in-chief for 40 days of service. Edward envisioned a prolonged campaign, and to achieve it, he relied increasingly on the indenture system. Contracts were drawn up between the crown and experienced captains, often nobles or wealthy knights, who agreed to provide a certain number of men-at-arms and archers for a specified term, usually a year, in exchange for regular wages. This created a more professional, disciplined force, loyal to their captain and, by extension, to the king who paid him. These captains scoured the towns and villages, their recruiters offering good wages and the lure of plunder to strong yeomen and restless younger sons with little to inherit. And at the heart of this new model army was a weapon that would become the great equalizer of the battlefields of France, the English longbow. It was not a new invention, its origins were Welsh, but under Edward I and now Edward III, its use was systematized and perfected into a doctrine of terrifying efficiency. The yew longbow, standing as tall as a man, required immense strength to draw, a strength built up from childhood. English law mandated longbow practice for all yeomen. It was a national pastime and a sacred duty. A skilled archer could loose a dozen arrows a minute, each capable of punching through plate armor at 100 yards. Against the massed cavalry charges that were the pride of French chivalry, the longbow would prove to be a weapon of mass destruction. Meanwhile, in France, Philip prepared for a different kind of war. His confidence lay in the immense wealth and population of his kingdom, and in the glorious tradition of French knighthood, considered the finest in Christendom. His call to the arriere band mobilized the entire military nobility. Great lords like the Duke of Normandy and the Count of Alençon gathered their retinues, their banners a dazzling display of heraldic pride. Their armies were top-heavy with heavily armored men-at-arms, knights and noblemen encased in steel, mounted on powerful destriers bred for the shock of combat. They were the embodiment of martial virtue, but their tactics were those of a bygone era, reliant on the decisive charge of mounted aristocracy. They viewed the English, with their reliance on common archers, with contempt. It was a clash not just of nations, but of military philosophies. The first blows of the war were not grand set-piece battles, but a series of brutal chevauchées, great mounted raids deep into enemy territory. The strategy favored by Edward was one of economic and psychological warfare. His armies would sweep through the French countryside, not to conquer and hold land, but to burn, pillage, and destroy. They would ravage the peasantry, burn crops, and sack wealthy towns, demonstrating the French crown's inability to protect its own people and crippling its tax base. The terror these raids inspired was a weapon in itself. In the autumn of 1339, Edward led such a force into the Cambrésis region of northeastern France. The landscape, so rich and peaceful weeks before, was transformed into a vision of hell. The sky was stained black with smoke from burning villages. The air rang with the screams of the victims, the lowing of terrified cattle, and the triumphant shouts of the soldiery. Fields of ripe grain were put to the torch, orchards were hacked down, and monasteries were not spared, their treasures looted, their sacred vessels melted down for bullion.